Without further ado, our next discussion is pricing carbon, driving the economics of emissions reduction. So we're all getting a lot of carbon education this afternoon. There's some carbon in the news today that might come up in the chit chat. But without further ado, Chip, the mic is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff. So this is one of the conversations that I've been looking forward to because we're going to talk about a carbon tax, which is, you know, a three-letter word that has become somewhat of a non-starter in our society. Anything attached to a tax doesn't seem to get anywhere. So I'd like to introduce Catrina Rorke from our street and Richard Eidlin from the American Sustainable Business Council. Maybe you can just give us just 30 seconds on a brief overview of our street and then also on ASBC.
Great. So our street is a very old think tank. We just turned 5 at the beginning of the month. We got our start actually as the DC office of the Heartland Institute. The DC office handled a lot of issues related to insurance reform. Not health insurance, all the sexy stuff, so flood insurance and crop insurance. And to work on those issues, you need to assemble a pretty big coalition that cares about all sorts of different kinds of risk. And one of the most powerful risk signals in both of those fields is the climate signal. So when our friends at Heartland started really committing to undermining the scientific consensus around climate change, there was opportunity to create a new libertarian, a new free market conservative brand that took those issues seriously, and hence the R Street Institute was born. Since then, we've been working on a multitude of issues, not just carbon, but technology, finance reform, how Congress should function, which is very apt today. And I founded our energy portfolio about 2.5 years ago.
Great, thank you. And Richard?
Yeah, and the American Sustainable Business Council is a national business advocacy group. We're a policy shop. We have a C3 and a C4, and we see ourselves sort of as the policy counterweight to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We focus on representing triple bottom line companies in Congress and at the state level. We work on wide portfolio of issues, everything from climate change to healthcare to workplace practices to employee stock-owned plans to trade policy to the Farm Bill. And we've worked on carbon pricing for a number of years now.
Great. So we're up here to talk about the carbon tax. I'm just going to briefly background that my experience started somewhere back around the Copenhagen COP15. We were hopeful for a cap and trade that I was in DC actually following that meeting where Nancy Pelosi had delivered Congress and Barbara Boxer actually came into the room where we were. My colleague Sally was there, Ted Turner, a number of others, with John Kerry, and said, we're taking this into the Senate. We have Lindsey Graham. And we thought, great, this is going to work. We're going to get a price point on carbon in the spring of 2010. And that was quickly killed at the White House. And ever since then, we've sort of been muddling along, talking about how great it would be to put a price on carbon without really getting one. So let's just bring us right up to today's conversation. And maybe we can start with you, Catrina, in terms of why is it that a right-of-center organization like our street would even want a carbon tax or a price point on carbon?
Yeah.
And how hopeful are you that we'll get one?
Sure. So why would we want a price point on carbon? The R Street Institute, again, we're a free market, conservative, libertarian, pick your adjective institution. We believe that markets are superior aggregators of information. The one thing that's missing from markets right now is that this is an externality, that carbon bears cost. So a simple, transparent, economy-wide way to address this is just to impose a carbon price. It's not outside the bounds of possibility of governance, and it's definitely the most administratively simple way to approach this. So that's what we advocate for. It has the benefit of doing a couple of other things consistent with our mission. First, it can preempt existing regulations, which means government can get smaller while addressing climate change more effectively. It creates a source of revenue that can do plenty cool things that we can certainly fight about, but in our view, it can offset some of the most damaging and distorting taxes that exist today, particularly taxes to capital. We advance a series of work that approaches eliminating the corporate income tax using carbon tax revenue. So that's our interest. We think the market can handle it if it's given the right signal.
Great, and before we go to you, Richard, I just want to, what would you do with the revenue?
Yeah, so we need to do some modeling on this, but a relatively modest price on carbon, starting at less than $40 a ton and rising at a pretty simple rate, about 3 or 4% over inflation, can actually just completely replace the corporate income tax that exists today.
Okay, so you're saying eliminate the corporate income tax, and that's going to spur growth in business sectors. Richard, how do you respond to that over to ASBC?
Yeah, so we share a lot of same perspective that a carbon tax is the best way to deal with this huge externality of carbon pollution and climate change, and that it will be an efficient way to address the problem. Our perspective is we're not convinced that a corporate income tax wholesale reduction is the best strategy. We're not sure that's the most stimulative impact, that it would have the most stimulative impact. So we'd like to see some of the dollars reinvested in clean tech, in infrastructure, but also appreciate that a dividends approach, which is what Ted Halstead's group today and a number of others got behind with the Climate Leadership Council, that is probably the politically most acceptable approach. And the other concern we have, Chip, with a corporate income tax reduction is, what types of companies will really benefit? Is that just the largest companies in the economy? And what about small and mid-sized companies?
Right, okay, so we have a dividend back to the consumer. Here we have a reduction of the corporate income tax over at R Street. Where do you see the funds, whether it's the elimination of a corporate income tax or the dividend, going to actually the previous panel's discussion about the need to actually eliminate carbon from going into the atmosphere? I mean, how does this mechanism actually do that?
So one of the ways it can do that is by ascribing a negative value, so pay people to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. That can certainly be negotiated in the context of tax reform that captures a carbon tax. Carbon tax is flexible in that way, but it doesn't specifically address it in this sort of basic formulation that we've been talking about.
And Richard, do you see, how does it address the climate crisis?
Yeah, well, it's what we call a market signal. So it will definitely effectuate behavior both at the consumer level and upstream at the 2,300 sites across the country where the tax would likely be imposed. So it will affect manufacturing, it will affect mining, it will affect the planning horizon of companies who want to minimize their risk and their exposure to price fluctuations. So all the modeling suggests it's going to definitely impact consumer behavior and corporate behavior, and we know that from watching what's happened in Canada and a few other countries around the world where emissions have fallen as the price has risen.
So in other words, go ahead.
If I can add, so a really powerful part of taxes is that taxes can be adjusted at the border. Regulatory policies cannot. So if the United States adopts a carbon tax, then we can adjust it at the border. Not necessarily compel other countries to join us in the same activity, but certainly make it really difficult to not have a robust carbon policy of their own.
Yeah, and Chip, this cross-border tax adjustment is, has been a big issue for a number of years now. So I think we both share the perspective not to disadvantage American companies as we adopt a price on carbon, and the same issue applies at the state level, interestingly enough. So in Massachusetts, one of the leaders in the country right now in looking at a price on carbon, there's concern that if Massachusetts adopts a tax, what happens to Connecticut, Rhode Island, adjacent states, and does that make Massachusetts more or less competitive?
Right, so let's talk about that. Without any real leadership, excuse me, at the federal level, we're starting to see some movement at the state level. Now we have Massachusetts. What other states are really taking a hard look at coming up with a legislative
Solution.
piece.
Yeah, there are about 10 states in the country, so it tends to be coastal. So California has a bill, and that's now been introduced in the legislature. Oregon, Washington had a ballot initiative, which lost, but that's because the environmental community got into a big fight among themselves about what to do with the revenue. Interesting lesson learned. And then in the Northeast, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut are the other states. And so what we find really hopeful is that in the face of no leadership from the Trump administration on this issue, that states are really stepping up, and there's increasing momentum at the state level.
The District of Columbia, too.
There's another, yes.
Maybe ironically.
Yes. Yep.
Great. You know, I drive a Chevy Volt, and when I bought it, you know, there was a pretty significant tax credit. And I'm wondering, do you see that a price on carbon, whether it's a tax or a tax and dividend, would drive consumers, as an example, to purchase electric vehicles? You know, as one of the stimulus, or, I mean, how does that actually apply? I'm really looking for those mechanisms where it does reduce the carbon throughput to the atmosphere, and then ultimately, to Klaus's point, to pull it out.
Right.
So the transportation sector is actually one that is less affected by a carbon price signal than the power sector. So it might be imperfect in driving the kind of expeditious change that many would like to see. However, the benefit of a carbon price is that it finds the least cost emissions reductions. So it doesn't necessarily obviate the need for accelerating rapid uptake of electric vehicles in the transportation sector, but can find lower cost ways of achieving the same benefits. And that's really important. We're not looking for specific kinds of technology outcomes. We're looking to solve the climate challenge.
Yeah, and Chip, to build on that, the price signal, you know, there are different approaches to this, but the price would be applied at the point of entry to the United States or the major manufacturing and emission sites in the country. And so EPA estimates there are 2,400 of those sites. So that's where the price signal is implanted. And then obviously manufacturers and mining companies and others will distribute that cost throughout the economy. So you'll see commensurate increases probably in the price of electricity, which is where the idea of the dividend gets then factored in. So that many studies suggest that as the price of electricity increases, so people pay more to their utility, they'll get more back in a dividend. So the net is actually a benefit for most consumers. That's one approach. And then on the corporate side, what would you say?
Sure. So yes, mechanism of change is this upstream cost in fossil fuel consuming industries. So at the mine mouth for coal, probably during the gathering process for natural gas, and probably at the distillation facility or petroleum processing facilities. And so at all of these points, you insert a cost. That cost will be passed through, especially in a sector like the fossil energy sector, because products are basically the same between companies. So yes, we will pay the carbon price. I think that a dividend isn't necessarily the best because we want people to pay that carbon price. And we want them to pay it in a way that's transparent. So I think what the carbon dividend does is it creates a constituency to never have the carbon price be so effective that that dividend check goes down. And that's definitely going to put a cap on the ability of this policy to effectuate change to the point of actually solving the climate crisis.
Right. Yeah, and Chip, we had talked before about, you know, is this a partisan idea? You know, is this an idea that only liberals, like Senator Sheldon in White House, thinks is a good idea? Or is this also being embraced by conservatives? And so, you know, Catrina, our organization have worked for a few years on promoting this idea. But what we also find really encouraging is that in Congress, there are quite a few Republican members of the House in particular, and, you know, 8 to 10 in the Senate, that believe that we need to price carbon.
I hear you. And so I just want to comment that, you know, given the recent events in France and the new president there and actually the new parliament, and then of course, it seems that that energetic dynamic has spread across the channel, and now England may not even execute Brexit, perhaps. And who knows, maybe that's even heading across the pond back over here. We don't know. Things are changing very rapidly politically, but when you have the Freedom Coalition, I think 30 members in Congress pretty much setting the agenda there, and then with Mitch McConnell in the Senate, I mean, how close are we realistically to even having anything with the word tax attached to it coming up legislatively at the federal level?
I think that's a really great question, and I'm quite glad that it came up because we do have something with the word tax in it pressing at Congress right now, and that is tax reform. Tax reform needs a source of revenue because what we want to see is reduced rates and a broader base. That's pretty expensive. Congress put forth a solution for a domestic basis tax, domestic basis cash flow tax, the BAT. The BAT was unpopular. Tax reform discussions collapsed. And now we're in this state where we know that Congress was willing to sacrifice coalition partners in Coke world who opposed this tax, retailers, at car companies. They were willing to sacrifice allegiances to those communities for the sake of tax reform. The benefit that a carbon tax has is that the only enemy that I know will come to the fore in that conversation is those people that we think of as being associated with Coke world, the ones who don't really want to see any federal level action on a carbon price or even on the manipulation of our regulations in the arena. And so if we can back down 2 of the big constituencies in order to afford tax reform, I think we're on the right track.
Yeah, and our sense is that, excuse me, we'll know a lot more after the midterm elections next year. So we don't anticipate anything happening on this issue, likely between now and next November. But the winds may change, and to Catrina's point of needing some tax reform here structurally in the economy may give impetus and some light to the idea of a price on carbon.
Well, it's very encouraging that we're actually having this conversation in light of, you know, the recent turn of events. And so I think with a minute left, I'd like to take it to the audience, and maybe I see a hand over there. Burning in the back.
Yeah, I have a big question. What's missing is in this conversation, I feel like, is how does the collection and then redistribution of carbon tax monies affect low-income and impoverished people and communities? As you guys may all know, Citizens Climate Lobby tries to address this with money coming back, the dividends coming back to all households across the country equally. How does ASB Council and our Street Institute address this issue of potentially disproportionate impacts being felt by the poorest members of our society?
Yeah, so we have that concern, and so the redistributive nature of a carbon tax has to take into account that problem. So there are a number of ways to address it. The Alaska Permanent Fund, is one model where every citizen in Alaska, if you've been there a year or longer, gets a dividend check. Citizens Climate Lobby is another approach, but I don't think that is actually based on income. So there are other models where, based on your income level, you will get more back. So as you make more money and as your income rises, you get less back. So the idea is not to burden low-income households with yet another tax. So we're very concerned about that adverse impact and that unintended consequence.
Yeah, so the reason, and maybe I should have talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but the reason that our street wants to tackle the most sort of distortionary taxes in the economy, taxes to capital, is because we don't want to sacrifice economic growth to solve the climate challenge. We don't have to. We can do that by reducing the most distortionary taxes in the economy with the carbon tax revenue. Now, if we do that, then the burden in the tax code is going to stop being as progressive as it is today. And we recognize that that is an issue, not just politically and for optics, but for people's livelihoods. And so we've been working for a long time with folks like Chad Stone at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities to devise the kinds of solutions that will take us out of that.
Great. Well, with that, we're out of time, and you have the last word. Thank you both for coming and having this conversation that we've been discussing for at least 15, maybe 20 years in our country.
Thank you.